She had him removed from her restaurant in front of 40 guests, 2 food critics, and a wall of windows overlooking the harbor. Claire Whitfield did it with a smile, which was the part that would stay with her longest afterward. She told the hostess to handle it, and the hostess did what she was told, and the man in the worn canvas jacket stood up from his table without argument and walked out carrying his water glass for a moment before he remembered to set it down. He was calm the whole time. That was the first thing she missed. The second was the folder he'd left on the table. She didn't open it for 6 minutes. By then, the deal was already gone. The morning had started at 4:47 in the way that difficult mornings always did for Claire, quietly, with a kind of held breath, the city outside her condo window still running on its overnight logic of delivery trucks and streetlights. She made coffee standing at the counter and stared at the lake while it brewed, and she let herself feel, for exactly as long as it took the pot to fill, the particular weight of everything that depended on the next 8 hours. Whitfield Hospitality had been her company for 6 years. She'd taken it over from her aunt at 29, the year the original flagship location had needed a full financial restructuring, and the board of silent investors had been suggesting, politely, and then less politely, that perhaps a management change was overdue. She'd disagreed. Eventually, though it had taken 2 years of work that she still couldn't fully describe to anyone who hadn't been in the rooms with her. What she had now was a portfolio of 4 properties across southern Ontario, a 5th in development, a reputation that had taken years to build in a market that did not forgive slowness or error, and a financing gap that had been the only thing she thought about for the last 11 weeks. The Alderton Group deal was supposed to close that gap, fully. Her CFO, a careful man named Patrick who communicated primarily in spreadsheets and understatement, had laid it out over dinner in March. Without the capital injection, the Lakeshore development would stall in Q3. They could manage probably by redirecting cash from the operating properties, but that was the kind of move that looked fine on paper and felt like pulling a thread from something you were still wearing. Claire had listened and asked 2 questions, and then told Patrick she would handle it. She'd been preparing for the Alderton meeting for 3 weeks. She'd restructured the pitch twice after getting additional due diligence notes from the Alderton team's preliminary questions. She'd flown to Toronto to present financial projections to their senior analyst. She'd revised the development timeline once after a site review flagged a drainage issue that had since been resolved. She'd done everything right, or everything she thought was right, which as it turned out was not exactly the same thing. The Alderton Group's principal, a man named Seth Alderton, had a profile that existed mostly as a rumor. He wasn't quoted in industry press. He didn't appear at conferences. The one photograph she'd been able to find was from a charity gala 6 years ago, where he was standing in the back row, slightly out of focus, which she later thought was probably not accidental. What she knew, he'd built his investment portfolio from a single commercial property deal in his late 20s, had compounded it over 15 years with a discipline that people in the industry described as almost uncomfortably consistent, and had a reputation for walking away from anything that felt wrong in the room. The last part had been mentioned to her by 2 separate sources, both of whom had said it like a warning. Her operations director, a woman named Bridget, who had been with the company since the 2nd location and who communicated primarily in complete sentences and raised eyebrows, had said when Claire told her the meeting was confirmed, "Just don't let the room get ahead of itself." Claire had nodded. She hadn't entirely known what that meant. She did now. The restaurant had been chosen deliberately, their flagship location in the Distillery District, the one that had anchored the whole portfolio, the one her aunt had opened 23 years ago with money borrowed from 3 sources and a lease agreement that most people had said was aggressive and that had turned out to be far-sighted. It was a beautiful room. High ceilings, exposed brick, a wine wall that ran the full length of the back. On a Tuesday morning, it had a pre-service quiet that Claire had always found steadying, the particular stillness of a space that knew what it was for. She arrived at 7 to go over the setup. Her events coordinator had placed their reserved table in the east corner, which got the best morning light and was slightly removed from the main floor, private without being isolated. She approved the table arrangement, confirmed the water service, reviewed the menu she'd had her chef prepare as a demonstration of what the Lakeshore location would be capable of. She had done everything right. Seth Alderton's office had confirmed 2 attendees, his associate, a woman named Priya, and Seth himself, arriving separately. At 9:45, Priya was already at the bar working on her laptop, dark suit, professional. The manner of someone who was extremely competent and had learned to make that invisible. They'd exchanged a brief hello. Claire liked her immediately, which should have told her something about the judgment she extended to the people who worked with Seth Alderton. The restaurant filled slowly with its Tuesday morning regulars and one table of what appeared to be a pre-service staff meeting from a competing property 2 blocks over, which Claire noted and let go. She was at the bar talking through the morning's reservation flow with her front-of-house manager when the door opened at 9:58. She heard the shift before she saw it. The way the room rearranged itself slightly, the way a room does when someone enters who changes the geometry of it. She looked up. A man had come in alone. He was perhaps 40, though he wore it the way some people wore age, not as accumulation but as clarity. There was a quality of someone who had stopped performing anything and was simply present. He was wearing dark jeans and a canvas jacket, the kind with the waxed collar that you got from an outfitter and wore for 20 years. He was holding a paper cup from the bakery 2 doors down the street. He stood in the entrance looking around the room with the expression of someone mildly interested in what they were seeing, and then he walked to the east corner table and sat down. Her front-of-house manager, a young man named Kevin, was already moving. Kevin was 26, excellent at service, trained on the principle that every table was treated equally until the table indicated otherwise, and that day had taken the instruction about their private reservation seriously. "Good morning," Kevin said. "I'm sorry, this table has been reserved for a private event. Can I help you find something on the main floor?" The man looked up. He had a kind of steadiness in the way he met people's eyes. Not aggressive, just settled, as if the interaction was something he was in no hurry to resolve one way or another. "I'm good here," he said. "Thanks." "The reservation starts in a few minutes," Kevin said. He was being professional. He was doing his job. "I know," the man said. Claire had crossed the floor by then, not because she'd sensed anything specifically, but because her meeting was about to start, and the table wasn't clear. She looked at the man. Something at the edge of her recognition snagged on something and didn't quite catch. "Hi, I'm Claire Whitfield. Was there a mix-up with the reservation?" The man looked at her. He didn't seem thrown by the question. "No mix-up," he said. "I'm here for 10. Claire glanced back at Priya, who had looked up from her laptop at the bar. The look on Priya's face was the look of someone watching a situation develop that they could not stop and had perhaps watched develop before. Not alarm exactly, more like recognition. Claire looked at the man, looked at the canvas jacket, looked at the paper coffee cup, looked at the table she needed to be at in 2 minutes. She should have stopped. She would tell herself this many times afterward. On the drive home that evening, lying awake at 2 in the morning, sitting in the parking garage of her building at 11 p.m., with the car running because she hadn't been ready to go inside yet. The moment was there. She had everything she needed to catch it. His ease in the room, the way he'd sat down without hesitation, Priya's expression. She needed 3 more seconds and one question. She didn't ask it. "I'm sorry," she said, and she heard herself using the voice she used when the room needed managing, clear and efficient and not unkind. "This is a reserved event. If you're with our 10 o'clock, could I ask you to check in with my team at the front? We can confirm your name on the list." The man looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not hurt, not anger, something more private than either. The quiet notation of someone filing away a piece of information they had come here, at least in part, to collect. He said. He stood. He picked up his coffee. Kevin appeared beside him with the particular good manners of a young professional who had been told to move someone along and was doing it as graciously as possible. Claire had already turned back toward Priya. She heard the door. She didn't look up. Priya was at the table when Claire reached her, the laptop closed now, the leather portfolio set in front of her with the particular precision of someone arranging themselves to deliver news they hadn't chosen. "Priya, welcome. We're ready when you are. We're just waiting for." "Mr. Alderton comes on his own schedule," Priya said. Her voice was even and carefully neutral. "He doesn't always come through the front in the way people expect." Claire looked at the door. She looked at the east corner table, where the canvas jacket was no longer. She looked at Priya. Something cold and certain moved through her from the inside. "Could you?" she started. "He won't answer if you call," Priya said, not unkindly. "He's already made his decision." Claire stood very still. The restaurant moved around her. Tables filling, coffee being poured, the beginning of the morning service starting its own logic in the kitchen. She was aware of all of it, and none of it. "I need 1 minute," she said. She walked to the back and stood in the hallway outside the dry storage room and breathed. She was not someone who panicked in operational crises. She'd handled a kitchen fire during a private event for 80 people and gotten every guest safely relocated to a temporary service setup in the courtyard without losing a single cover. She'd renegotiated a supplier contract in a 40-minute phone call on 3 hours sleep. She'd held the company together through 2 years of restructuring at an age when most of her business school contemporaries were still in their second associate positions somewhere. She knew what she was doing. She had walked a man out of her own restaurant without asking his name. She went back to the table and told Priya she understood and asked if there was anything they could do. Priya said she didn't know, that Seth Alderton didn't revisit decisions as a practice, and that she was sorry. She said it like she meant it. Claire believed her. The meeting that followed was the longest 40 minutes of Claire's recent professional life. She presented to Priya anyway, because the alternative was nothing, and the alternative didn't serve anyone. She walked through the Lakeshore development pitch with precision she'd spent 3 weeks building. She answered every question Priya asked with care and specificity. She was good. She was always good at the table. The problem was that the table had the wrong people at it now, and both of them knew it. When Priya left, she took her business card and said she would pass everything along and that the materials were excellent and that she was genuinely sorry for how the morning had gone. Claire thanked her and shook her hand and waited until the door closed, and then sat at the east corner table in the morning light and looked at the folder the man in the canvas jacket had left behind when Kevin had walked him out. She opened it. Inside was a one-page letter on Alderton Group letterhead, dated that morning, outlining the terms of a proposed investment in the Lakeshore development. Not the terms Claire had proposed, better terms. More capital, longer runway, a partnership structure that included an advisory arrangement at no charge for the first operational year. She read it twice. She looked at the single line at the bottom where a signature was waiting for a name and a date. She read the letter a third time and then set it down and sat with the flat silence of someone who has just seen very clearly the shape of something they cannot undo. She didn't go home that night until nearly midnight. Bridget called at 10:30. She always seemed to know when something had gone sideways, operating on a professional frequency that Claire had stopped trying to explain and had simply come to rely on. What happened? Bridget said without preamble. Claire told her. Not all of it, but the shape of it. Bridget was quiet for a moment. He tests the room, Bridget said finally. I've heard that. I understand it now. The question is what you do next. Claire looked at the ceiling of her office. I don't know yet. Yes, you do, Bridget said. You just haven't let yourself say it. She started looking the next morning. She pulled everything available on Seth Alderton, not the profile she'd built for the pitch, which had focused on the investment history and the portfolio structure, but the person. There wasn't much. A profile piece in a regional business quarterly from 4 years ago, apparently agreed to only because a portion of the publication's proceeds supported a youth entrepreneurship program. A mention in a real estate industry newsletter, a brief reference in a profile of a charitable foundation he'd contributed to, which noted that he had declined to be photographed. The profile piece had a quote she read twice. He'd said, "I've never been interested in whether a room respects me. I'm interested in whether the room respects whoever walks into it next." She put the article down. She went to her window and stood there with her arms folded and looked at the city in the morning and thought about a man sitting at her reserved table with a paper coffee cup, in a jacket that cost nothing to look at, saying, "I know," when Kevin told him the reservation was about to start. He'd known exactly where he was. She was the one who hadn't known. She called Priya that afternoon. It rang 3 times. Priya answered and said, "Miss Whitfield," without surprise, which meant she'd been expecting the call. "I almost didn't pick up," Priya said. "He said you would call yourself and not have someone call for you." He said that mattered. Claire absorbed this. He was right, that it matters. I know, that's why I picked up. A pause. What happened this morning was embarrassing. For your property. Not for him? I know. I let my staff manage a situation I should have managed myself. I failed to do one thing that would have changed everything, which is ask his name. Silence. Then, he always comes alone, no advance notice from our side. He wants to see how a room reacts to someone who doesn't signal their value, and most rooms fail. Most rooms treat him like a problem to be managed. Another pause. He was watching you specifically. Not Kevin. Kevin was doing his job. Seth was watching to see what you would do when Kevin moved on him, and you were already looking somewhere else. Claire said nothing for a moment. Outside her window, a pigeon landed on the air conditioning unit and sat there entirely unconcerned about everything. "Is there anything that can be done?" she said. "He doesn't reopen closed things," Priya said. "Not as a rule. A beat. But he did ask me one question this morning. He asked if you found the folder." Claire looked at her desk, where the Alderton Group letter was sitting under a paperweight shaped like a small lighthouse that she'd bought at a gift shop in Nova Scotia on a vacation she couldn't fully remember taking. "I found the folder," Claire said. "He knows," Priya said. He asked if you read it before or after you understood who he was. After. A pause that felt like something being weighed. I'll tell him that, Priya said. 3 days later, Patrick came to her office at 3 in the afternoon and closed the door. He only closed the door when the news required it. I've been going through something, he said, and sat down. He placed a single handwritten page on her desk. Patrick's handwriting was tiny and very exact, the handwriting of someone who had learned early that precision on paper was a form of care. He'd been looking at their board of advisors. Whitfield Hospitality had a 4-person advisory structure, put in place 5 years ago when the expansion had required a level of governance that the original family business model hadn't needed. One of those advisors was a man named Gerald Thorne. Gerald had introduced himself to Claire 2 years into her tenure as a connector, someone who knew everyone in the Ontario commercial real estate and hospitality financing world, and whose introductions, he'd told her, had opened doors for properties like hers across the province. He hadn't been wrong, technically. The introductions had been real. The doors had opened. What Patrick had found, working backwards from the Alderton Group's withdrawal and forwards from the terms of the Lakeshore Development's existing advisory arrangement, was a thread. Gerald Thorne was a co-investor in a financing vehicle called Northgate Capital Partners, which had approached Whitfield Hospitality the morning after the Alderton meeting. Northgate's lead investor was a holding company called Harwick Ventures. Harwick Ventures was incorporated 18 months ago. Its registered address was a firm that counted among its corporate clients Gerald Thorne. Claire looked at the handwritten page. She looked at it for a while. "How sure?" she said. "I've been at this for 2 days," Patrick said. "I'm sure enough." The room was very quiet. The kitchen below them was mid-prep for the evening service, and she could hear the distant register of it, pans and instruction, and the kind of organized noise that she loved about this business because it meant everything was moving the way it was supposed to move. It sounded very far away. Gerald had been enthusiastic about the Alderton meeting, more than enthusiastic. She thought now about a lunch 6 weeks before the meeting where he'd leaned across the table and said, "This is your moment, Claire. Alderton money legitimizes everything you've built." She'd taken it as encouragement. She was rereading it now in a different register entirely. She looked at Patrick. "Don't say anything to anyone yet." He nodded. "I haven't. I need to think." She thought for a long time. She thought while the evening service ran below her. She thought through the drive home and the hours she spent on her couch in her coat because she hadn't gotten around to taking it off. She thought about the shape of what she was looking at. Gerald, who had been in her corner since the beginning of the expansion period, who had been the one to say Alderton money legitimizes everything, who had already arranged an alternative waiting in the wings when the Alderton deal fell. She thought about the timing of the Northgate approach, less than 12 hours after the meeting, which she had registered at the time as an unfortunate coincidence, and which she now understood was not a coincidence at all. She had been positioned. She went back to the office the next morning at 6 and sat in the empty restaurant before anyone arrived, and looked at the east corner table and thought about the folder sitting in the letter tray on her desk upstairs. She thought about the letter inside it, the offer. The offer that was still technically on the table, even though the meeting had gone the way it had, which she didn't yet know what to make of. She called Priya at 8:30. Priya picked up. "I need to tell you something," Claire said. "Not about the deal, about something inside my company." She paused. "I'm not asking for his help. I'm telling you because I think he may already know part of it, and because if he does, I'd rather he hear it from me." Priya was quiet for a moment. Then, "Hold on." The line went silent. Not hold music, just silence. Then Seth Alderton's voice. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said. His voice was even, unhurried, the voice of someone who had been in the conversation from the beginning even though he'd just arrived in it. "Mr. Alderton, I'm sorry to. Don't apologize for calling," he said. "Tell me what you found," she told him. Not everything. She had perhaps 40% of the picture at that point, but the structure of it, Gerald's connection to Northgate, the timeline, the sense she had of something that had been built slowly and around her over a longer period than she'd understood. She told him plainly, the way she might have briefed her board, without editorializing, without the emotional weight that she was carrying and had chosen to keep out of her voice. When she finished, he was quiet for a few seconds. "Gerald Thorne reached out to my office," he said, 8 days before your meeting, through an intermediary. He represented that the deal structure you were proposing would include a preferential advisory arrangement for a consulting group connected to him. He represented this as something you had authorized. Claire sat very still. "I had not authorized it. I know that now." A pause. "I came to the meeting to see whether what I'd been told was true about how your operation ran. Whether you were the kind of person who built arrangements like that and then sent someone else into the room while you watched from a distance. And then I sent Kevin into the room while I watched from a distance. A beat, not quite silence, more like the considered space between one thing and the next. Different situation, he said. Same failure of attention. Another pause. What are you going to do? I'm going to build the case, she said, properly, with legal counsel, and then I'm going to present it to my board. Can you prove the Northgate connection on paper? I can get partway there. Patrick has the structure. I need a lawyer to tell me whether it constitutes what I think it constitutes. Get your lawyer first, he said, before you move anything else. And Ms. Whitfield, yes, this has to be your work, not mine. If you do this because someone else built the road, it belongs to whoever built the road. She understood exactly what he meant. She told him so. I know you understand, he said. That's why I took the call. She retained a lawyer that afternoon. Her name was Frances Osei, corporate litigation, 22 years of practice, the kind of professional who answered the phone in a way that made you feel the situation was already being managed even before you'd described it. Frances listened to Claire's summary without interrupting and asked 3 precise questions and said, "Don't confront your advisor yet. Don't move the documentation from its current location, and get me everything by Friday." She got Frances everything by Thursday evening. Patrick worked through the week, quiet and methodical, building the document that neither of them could let sit on a shared drive. He found 3 more instances across 2 years where advisory contracts had gone to parties with connections to Gerald's network at rates above what the market would have supported. He found a development consultation from 18 months ago that had been billed at a flat fee significantly above comparable engagements, routed through an entity that, if you followed the paperwork far enough, led somewhere it shouldn't. He brought it to her on a Thursday afternoon, 68 pages. She read it that night at her kitchen table with a glass of wine she poured and didn't drink, and she felt something that was not anger and was not grief, though it had elements of both. It was the feeling of understanding, finally and completely, the shape of something you had been inside of without knowing the walls. Gerald had been doing this for a long time. Long enough that some of it predated her tenure, which meant he'd started under her aunt and had continued under her, adapting to the transition the way someone adapted who knew how to make themselves useful to whoever was in the chair. She put the pages down at midnight. She went to bed. She slept 4 hours and then woke up and lay in the dark and thought about the east corner table and a man sitting there with a coffee cup and every reason in the world to just leave and not say anything, and the folder he'd left behind anyway. The board meeting was called for a Monday. Claire submitted the formal request Sunday evening through the company's governance channel, citing the emergency provision, listing Patrick and Frances as supporting parties. She had 5 confirmations by 9 p.m. Gerald's came at 11:40. She noted the delay and said nothing about it to anyone. She had coffee with Bridget that morning at 7 before the building filled. "Today," Bridget said. "Today." Bridget looked at her across the small table in the back office with the expression of someone who had worked alongside Claire through the restructuring years and knew exactly what this cost. "You're ready," Bridget said. "I'm prepared," Claire said. "It's not exactly the same thing." Bridget almost smiled. "No, but prepared is enough." The board met at 10 in the private dining room on the 2nd floor, the one they used for serious things, with the long walnut table and the windows that looked out over the courtyard where they did their summer events. 5 board members, Frances to Claire's left, Patrick across from her with the documentation, and Gerald Thorne at the far end in a charcoal jacket, looking exactly as he always looked, warm, attentive, the manner of a man who had spent years making rooms comfortable and had become very good at it. He looked at the table when Claire set the documentation down. Something crossed his face. "Not nothing," she began. She led with the timeline. Not Gerald's name. The pattern first, the way Frances had advised. Because a room that sees the shape of something before it sees the name arrives at the name's meaning rather than just its accusation. She walked the board through the advisory contract structure, the rate discrepancies, the entity connections. She was flat and precise, and she didn't use adjectives. She presented the Northgate timeline, the approach, the timing, the relationship to the Alderton meeting's collapse. She laid out the intermediary contact, what had been communicated to Seth Alderton's office, what had been represented as authorized, what had not been. Gerald interrupted once. "I'd like to respond to, under the emergency disclosure provision," Claire said without looking up from the documents, "a sitting CEO may complete an active disclosure before the floor is opened for response. I'd ask for that courtesy, Gerald." She said his name evenly. She looked at him when she said it. She held the look for 2 seconds and then looked back at the board. She presented Francis's analysis. She presented the Northgate registration documents and the entity chain Patrick had built. She presented last a written summary from Seth Alderton, provided voluntarily, documenting the intermediary contact, the date, and the specific terms that had been represented to him. She did not read it aloud in full. She summarized it in 3 sentences and set the document where the board could see it. She stopped. She looked at the room. 2 board members were looking at Gerald. The third was writing something on a notepad. The fourth, a woman named Sylvie, who had been on the board since the original restructuring and who had seen 2 other governance crises in her tenure on other boards and spoke rarely but with full weight when she did, was simply looking at the table with an expression that had left warmth behind. Gerald looked at Claire. She had been told by Francis that he would do this, that he would use the relationship that had been built across years in this company to try to make her feel like the disruption in the room rather than the person addressing the disruption. Francis had said, "Look back, don't look away." She looked back. "These are serious allegations," Gerald said. His voice was composed, still warm around the edges, though the warmth was working harder now than it usually had to. "And I want to address them, but I think the board deserves context. What we have here is a set of financial connections that are being interpreted through the lens of a very stressful period for this company, following a significant deal that didn't come together the way we hoped." He looked around the table. "Claire has built something remarkable here, and I think this board knows how much I've supported." "Sylvie," Claire said. Sylvie looked up. "Would you move to authorize an independent audit of all advisory contracts, vendor arrangements, and external referrals involving Gerald Thorne's tenure for the preceding 3 years?" Sylvie looked at Gerald once. The look had no hostility in it and no warmth. It was the look of someone removing something from a calculation. "So moved," she said. The vote was 4-1. Gerald's was the one. He voted looking straight ahead, not at Claire, his jaw set. The composed warmth was entirely gone, and what was underneath it was smaller and harder and less impressive than the version she'd worked with for 2 years. When the second motion carried, Gerald's recusal from all board activities pending the audit's completion, he stood and straightened his jacket and looked at her. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "I don't think I am," she said. He left. The door closed. The room exhaled. Sylvie looked at Claire across the walnut table with the look of someone who had been through enough of these to know what they cost. "Well done," Sylvie said. "That was all. It was enough." Claire sat at the table after everyone had gone. She put both hands flat on the wood and breathed. Outside the courtyard window, a bird she couldn't identify was moving through the rose bushes along the back fence. The kitchen below was running the 11 o'clock prep cycle. The building was doing what the building always did, which was carry on, and she found that steadying. She picked up her phone. She sent Priya a text, "Board voted. Audit authorized. He's been recused." She paused and then added, "I held the room." Priya's reply came back in 7 minutes. 4 words. "He knew you would. The audit took 8 weeks. The independent firm. Francis's recommendation, no prior relationship with Whitfield Hospitality, was thorough and dispassionate and delivered their report on a Wednesday afternoon in a meeting that lasted 90 minutes and covered 44 pages of findings. Gerald had been redirecting advisory fees and development referrals for nearly 4 years. The amounts were not catastrophic in isolation. The pattern was 3 vendor relationships at above market rates, all traceable to connected entities. 1 development consultation billed for work that had been, according to the on-site project records, completed in approximately half the documented hours. And the Alderton situation, which the audit characterized in its summary as a deliberate interference in a prospective capital arrangement for the personal financial benefit of a party representing a conflicting interest. Claire read the report in her office with Patrick and Francis and then sat with it for a while after they left. She thought about 4 years. She had been running this company for 6 years, which meant Gerald had started under her and had worked out over time how to build his arrangements around the way she managed. Around her attention and where it went and where it didn't. Around the trust she extended to people who'd been in the room since before she was. She thought about the East Corner table and the moment she'd turned away. She thought about what that moment had cost and what it had also eventually shown her. She picked up her phone and called her CFO. "Patrick, we're going to restructure the advisory governance entirely. New disclosure requirements, conflict of interest reviews, all of it. I want you to lead it." "I was hoping you'd say that," he said. "I've been thinking about what the structure should look like. Come in tomorrow at 8. Bring your thinking." He came in at 8. He brought his thinking. They built the new framework over 3 sessions across 2 weeks, with Francis reviewing each draft, and Sylvie, who had agreed to chair an interim governance committee, providing the board-level input. It was better than what they'd had. It was more honest about where the vulnerabilities were and more specific about how to address them. She sent an email to every employee in all 4 properties on the Tuesday before the audit went public. She wrote it herself. She told them the truth in plain language. An advisor had been removed pending an independent review. The company's operations were stable. She was not going anywhere. She ended it by telling them that what her aunt had built was worth protecting, and that they were the reason it was worth protecting. She received 43 replies by end of day. Some were short, some were longer than she expected. Several mentioned that they'd felt something wrong for a long time and hadn't known how to name it, or whether it was theirs to name. She kept those in a folder. She wasn't sure why. She kept them anyway. The Northgate approach, which had arrived the morning after the Alderton meeting, as though it had been sitting in a car outside with the engine running, was declined formally that same week. Claire sent the decline herself, a single paragraph, and did not explain. It was in the 4th week of the audit that Seth's message came. Not a call, a text, through Priya's number. It said, "Emma wants to know if you've tried the bakery on Gould Street. She found it the day we met you. She says the coffee isn't as good as yours, but the bread is better." Claire read it twice. She thought about the folder on the table. She thought about the bread being better. She wrote back, "I'll try it. Who is Emma?" The reply came in 2 minutes. "She's 8. She was with me that morning. She draws everything. She was in the courtyard when it happened." She thought about the courtyard. She thought about what it meant that an 8-year-old had been in it. She wrote, "I didn't know you had a daughter." He wrote, "Most people don't. I prefer it that way." She wrote, "Does she have opinions about hospitality too?" He wrote, "She has opinions about everything. It's her primary mode." Claire looked at the screen for a while. Then she typed, "Tell Emma I'll bring bread next time." The reply came back in 30 seconds. She says she'll believe it when she sees it. Claire set her phone down on her desk, and she laughed for the first time in 3 weeks. A real one, the unannounced kind that arrives before you've decided whether to let it. The second meeting with the Alderton group happened on a Thursday morning in March, 2 months after the audit closed. Claire had rebuilt the proposal entirely. Not the pitch she'd brought in November, a different document, cleaner, more honest about the company's current position and more specific about where it was going. The governance framework was included as its own section. She'd added a transparency provision she'd written herself, a mutual disclosure structure that Francis had said was unusual and Patrick had said was exactly right. She went to Seth Alderton's office rather than meeting at the restaurant. It seemed correct to come to him this time. He was at his desk when she arrived. He stood when she came in. He was wearing the same kind of jacket, the waxed canvas one, and she had stopped noticing it, or rather had started understanding what it meant, that he'd long since stopped needing a room to look at him a certain way and was interested only in what the room would do. They shook hands. "Thank you for making time," she said. "I had it," he said. They went through the proposal for an hour and 20 minutes. He asked good questions. She answered them directly, including twice saying, "I don't know the answer to that yet, and here's how I'm working toward it," which she could not have said in November without it feeling like a wound, and which she said in March without difficulty, because some things changed in the passage of hard months. When they reached the transparency provision, he paused. He read it twice. "This is unusual," he said. "I know. I wrote it myself." He set the document down. He looked at her steadily. "Subject to one revision to the capital structure on page 12, he said, "I'm ready to move forward." Claire absorbed the sentence. The morning light was coming through his office windows onto the table between them, and the city was doing its ordinary business outside, and somewhere in the city an 8-year-old with opinions about bread was presumably at school drawing everything she saw. "I'm glad," Claire said. "You built a better company," Seth said, "in 8 months." "I built the company I should have been running already," she said. "I just couldn't see all of it until I had to look." He nodded. It wasn't false modesty, so he didn't treat it like false modesty. He just received it as what it was, the plain accounting of someone who had gone through something and come out understanding it. They shook hands again at the door. This time the handshake meant something different. She walked out into the March morning, which was cold in the specific way that Canadian March is cold. Not the deep cold of January that you've accepted and made your peace with, but the sharp transitional cold of a season that is not yet willing to be over and not quite able to stay. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the city. She thought about November, a table, a folder, a man who had left it anyway. She thought about Gerald Thorne, who was currently working through his legal situation with the kind of slow, grinding institutional patience that such situations required, and that she had stopped spending energy thinking about because thinking about it didn't build anything. She thought about Bridget, who had called after the board vote and said simply, "I told you you knew what to do." She thought about Patrick, who had brought her 68 pages of careful handwriting, and who was now building the governance framework that should have existed from the beginning. She thought about Sylvie's look across the walnut table, about Francis on the phone. Don't wait until you're sure. Nobody's ever sure enough before they start. She thought about an 8-year-old in a courtyard drawing everything she saw. Her phone buzzed. A message from Priya. He says, "Well done." Emma says, "Can she see the restaurant sometime?" She wants to draw the wine wall. Claire read it standing on the March sidewalk. She read it twice. She wrote back, "Tell Emma yes. Anytime. Tell her we'll save her the corner table." She put the phone in her pocket. She started walking. The city moved around her, cold and ongoing and entirely indifferent to what had just happened in a glass-windowed office 12 floors above the street. And she found that she did not mind the indifference. The city's indifference was not hostile. It was just honest. The world was large, and it kept moving, and the small true things happened inside it, in restaurants and boardrooms and courtyard gardens, and they mattered precisely because the world did not stop for them. She walked 4 blocks before she slowed down, not because she was tired, because she was the kind of person who thought better when she was moving, and she had a company to run, and the thinking was good now, and she wanted to stay inside it a little longer before the day asked her for all the rest of it. She turned the corner. She kept walking. She realized, no longer waiting for the hard part to be over. She was simply in the next part, which was ordinary and full of work, and genuinely, unexpectedly hers. That was more than enough. That had always been the thing.